Dr. Craig Chalquist. I want to talk today a bit about divination as a spiritual practice. Divination is something I've been using for almost 3 decades now, maybe about that. I've used tarot cards, I have several sets. I Ching, we'll be talking about those later. Runes, geomancy, other things. And part of why I want to do this is divination is much misunderstood, both by its critics, but also practitioners. And I'd like to frame it as a practice within a spiritual life, a spiritual path. And what does that look like? Which is how it's often used. But I want to clear up a few things about this mysterious process by which we read the cosmos. Now, there's a word in English that we get from Latin, auguries, and it's a reference to how the Romans looked at birds as indicators of currents in the collective, indications that were coming down the pike, that kind of thing. And there are practices all over the world. If you go far back enough, probably in every single human culture, there are divination practices. And one of the misunderstandings is that people who don't use them and only see them from the outside and bring their own rationalistic assumptions in will often say it's superstition, we need to get beyond all that, it's magical thinking, and so forth. Those of us who've practiced divination for a long time have heard all of this. It's very shallow. A lot of straw man arguments, and we're going to go a bit deeper, but I wanted to mention that there's a way of holding this, and we'll come back to this at the end, that Jung proposed that actually goes around a lot of these objections and arguments. And he referred to synchronicity, which is a term some of us, of course, are familiar with. And the short explanation is meaningful coincidence. So you have a question about something urgent, you flip a card or two over or do a whole spread. And with uncanny accuracy, it seems to address what you're asking about. Or the spread is very confusing, but in a couple of days, events shift. And then you say to yourself, okay, now I know what's going on. So part of the reason from a Jungian perspective that this works is that everything that happens in a particular moment of time somehow, in some mysterious way, shares the qualities of that moment. So we're talking about something much more complex than simple causality, than the simple this causes that, which increasingly isn't even a good explanation for things right in front of us that we encounter every day. It's a sort of lazy habit of mind at this point. Philosophers have talked about that, Kant and others, Hume. And so when we think about divination as synchronicity, the way Jung held it was, and he consulted a lot with physicist Wolfgang Pauli about this, he kind of presents it as this undiscovered law of the cosmos, which maybe it is, but Jung was in a big hurry to present this on a scientific basis. And so he drew diagrams about it. Pauli wrote some things about it too. And that's certainly one way of holding it. The main thing about synchronicity is that the two events that are connected, so your question and then the turn of the cards or the toss of the I Ching coins or whatever, don't cause each other in this way of thinking. They're causally independent to some extent anyway, but one doesn't cause the other. And you really see this in natal charts, which we'll talk about a little bit too, in astrology. There's no way that I could cause, at the moment of my birth, Jupiter to be in the 10th house at the top of my chart. Jupiter in the 10th house at the top of my chart does not cause me to be born or to have certain personality traits. And that causal explanation piece is one of the biggest things that critics who don't understand astrology level against it. It's a straw man argument. Almost no astrologers think that way. So, Mars doesn't make people angry. That's not how it's held. Part of the problem, though, is that sometimes astrologers lapse into causal language about stuff like this. And then there's others too, I think a minority, who really want to make a causal case that there's like mysterious magnetism coming off the planets or gravity waves or whatever. But from a Jungian perspective, it's synchronicity. So me having certain personality traits and Jupiter at the top of my chart parallel each other, but they don't cause each other. So that's a way of holding all of this in terms of divination. There are some strengths about this way of holding it, but there's also a few limitations. So I'm going to go back to that later. But just to say up front that some of the claims that are made by critics don't really hold with the actual practice. And the critics don't practice, so they don't know this. It's always easy to criticize something that you've never tried out yourself. So let's talk a bit about some of the oracles that are in use. And what I want to do with this is not just mention them, and I'm certainly not going to go into a detailed explanation, but from the standpoint of using them as a spiritual practice, I'd like to give a few hints and make a few points that I've noticed along the way in my own successes and failures with some of these divination methods. And I hope this will be useful to free you to make use of them in ways that feel really comfortable. So one thing I'll mention too is so often it's the case where you have some kind of an imaginative, spiritual, intuitive, whatever it is, experience. And it's criticized on both sides of the house. The scientists don't like it. Some scientists, the ones who aren't open-minded. And on the other hand, it's the hyper-religious fundamentalist people who don't like it. So a lot of them will hold that divination is the devil's work and it's and all that stuff. I'm not even going to go into that. It's not even worth talking about. So we're not using it for that. And also not using it to predict the future. So more on that in a minute. So the I Ching might be the oldest book in the world. There are several candidates for that, including the Buddhist Diamond Sutra. And there's always the gap between tradition and when things get written down. So we know that the I Ching has been in use for at least 5,000 years, and it wouldn't surprise me to learn that it was older than that. And the tradition is that it's a method of divination that started by heating discarded tortoise shells. So once the tortoise had died, the shell was left. And when you heat it a certain way, cracks appear in it, and then you interpret the cracks according to some system of divination. So that's how, according to tradition, that's how the I Ching started. What it looks like today, in different translations, is it's a series of images, doubled images. And so these are called, in English, hexagrams, because they consist of 6 lines. So 64 images, 6 lines each. And there are different ways to cast your question and then get a reading from the I Ching. So the coin method of using 3 coins is very popular. That's the one I usually use. There's a more arduous but also more reflective way of doing it with traditional yarrow stalks where you divide them up and lay them down in certain patterns. It takes longer, but I think it really helps you sink into the question more and do the reading more reflectively. So the basic process is you have a question for the I Ching, you sit with it, formulate it, and when you're ready, you either cast the coins, use the yarrow stalks, and then in the book you look up the hexagram, and the hexagram sometimes is static, meaning that none of the 6 lines are in motion. They're not, this is called changing lines, or one or more of them is in motion. And there's a whole extra set of information about that. And it's based on the idea that because the hexagrams are made up of yin and yang lines, it's integral to Chinese philosophy, partly because of the I Ching, that everything is in flux and all polarities are playing with each other. So when we do a reading, what we're asking on a deeper level is, what is in flux right now? What's the situation look like from a higher perspective? And so the changing lines, when they're yin, change into yang lines, and then vice versa. So that's why it's called the Book of Changes. So again, according to tradition, the hexagrams were first derived from tortoise shells by Fu Xi, the wisdom of Fu Xi, the emperor and also shaman. He's a legendary figure. Goes back thousands of years. In the West, we ask questions like, "Did he really exist?" In China, it's like, "Well, he's a figure regardless, right? He's there. We know him, you know." So Fu Xi, the shaman emperor, according to tradition, came up with a sort of translation of the cracks on tortoise shells into the hexagrams. And then there's commentaries on each changing line. They're called Yao. And these were provided by the Duke of Zhou. And so King Wen and the Duke of Zhou, you could think of them as sort of the ideal wise leaders. And the Zhou dynasty goes back to 1045 BCE, so it's pretty old. And so some of this comes back down from there. And then another layer of this is that there are other commentaries in the I Ching that tradition says were written by Confucius himself. So all these different layers of commentary. By the time you do a reading and you soak up everything, it's really quite a lot of information. And it can be very specific. That's one of the things I love about the I Ching. Being a rather verbally oriented person, I really like the specificity of it. So you have to be careful with that, though, because if you ask about something serious, in my experience over 20 plus, almost 30 years of using this, is that it'll tell you the truth, and you may not want to hear it. So when I was, how old was I? When I was in my 20s and I first started experimenting with this, I heard about it because I was starting to study Jungian psychology, and Carl Jung not only talked about this and used the I Ching, but he wrote a kind of foreword or preface to the first Western edition of the I Ching. So, or the Wilhelm Baines version, I should say, translated by Carrie Baines. And so I recommend reading that. The translation now is a little bit outdated for a lot of reasons. But the front piece, which you could probably find online, is excellent. And Jung gives his own explanation of the synchronistic action of the I Ching. And he actually asks it, should I write this preface? And so he gives the reading in the article that he writes, in the preface that he writes. So it's worth reading. So at one time, there was a family that I had entered as part of a relationship. And I was just getting some funny feelings from them, but I was very committed to becoming a member of that family. And so I decided to do a I Ching reading. And hexagram 8 came up, which in the Wilhelm Baines version is translated as holding together. And the hexagram depicts a number of people being held in place by a strong line, a strong personality. And so that was the overall situation. The hexagram gives you an image of the overall situation. And there was one changing line. And so that gives you a more specific read on what the overall situation is. So I read the line. And in that translation, it said, "You hold together with the wrong people." It's very blunt. And which is one of the things I like about the I Ching, but sometimes it stings a bit. So at that stage, I didn't have the decades of practice with it that I do now, and I was just kind of, okay, whatever. And boy, was it right. So it was right on the mark. And then another time I did a reading, I can't remember what question I asked, but I didn't like the result. So I asked again. So this time, for the second reading, hexagram 4 came up. And it has to do with the beginner trying to gain knowledge. I think it's actually called childhood in different translations. But anyway, in the Wilhelm Baines, it has to do with beginnings. And the changing line that came up was a criticism of the fact that I kept going with the questions. And at one point in the reading of the hexagram as a whole, it's called Youthful Folly, by the way, at number 4 in the Wilhelm Baines. So the hexagram said, Youthful Folly. If he asks once, now get this, if he asks once, I'll give him information. If he asks more than once, he's being disrespectful, I'm paraphrasing, and I will tell him nothing further. And I felt like somebody had just criticized me, rightly. So with any divination method, this leads me to my first suggestion. With any of these methods, one question at a time, right? It's disrespectful to ask more than one. So that was the lesson I learned from the I Ching about that. In terms of using it, there's also the consideration of different cultures. And so the Alfred Huang translation is the current one that I use the most, because he goes into detail to express to the Western audience that he's writing to what the nuances are in Chinese culture. So he talks about who King Wen and the Duke of Zhou are, and he talks about this is what this line means to the Chinese. And so you get a much fuller appreciation of what you're actually dealing with. That translation was made in 2010 by a man who was imprisoned during the Cultural Revolution, and he spent a big chunk of his life trying to provide an accurate translation of the I Ching. He consulted other ones, including the Wilhelm Baines, and made some corrections too. So he's also a Taoist master. So I really like his version, Alfred Huang. I'm probably mispronouncing his name, but sorry about that. It's a great translation. So let's talk a little bit about astrology, just very briefly, in terms of the claims that it's been making. And I mentioned it before. For me, where things land is when I look at either my natal chart or what are called transits, which means how your natal chart configuration of planets is influenced by where the planets are right now. And from the standpoint of Earth, they're circling us along the ecliptic. And that's not supposed to be a scientific theory. We know about how the solar system works and all that. It's supposed to be, this is how things are revolving from the standpoint of where you are right now. So when you look at transits, say right now Mars is talking to my MC, which is the vertical axis of the natal chart. And so there's a lot up for me right now in terms of work and career and showing up in public, and this might be an aspect of it, doing this today. So, but not causal, and so let's talk about that a little bit. Where it lands for me is I look at my transits or my natal chart or whatever, and I ask where it resonates, because to me that's what's important. When there's something in it that makes sense to me on a visceral level, I tend to take it more seriously. So when I look at my natal chart, I remember how surprised I was the first time I had somebody work one up for me. And they said to me, well, do you know you're a double Cancer? And I said, what's a double Cancer? And they said, well, your rising sign is Cancer and your natal sign is Cancer. So you got both. You got a double dose. And I went, oh, and I looked up some of the qualities of a Cancer, and I thought, yeah, that makes sense. There's a whole other layer of complexity about house systems, which ones to use. They do give very different results. So if you learn enough to learn about what houses are, I recommend trying out different ones. Or if you have an astrologer do your chart, tell them to do it in different house systems, because they are different. They make a huge difference. So I work pretty good with Placidus. That's fairly accurate, except for one planet, which is a little iffy. But do try it out and see what resonates. That's the main thing. What resonates in terms of the symbolic meaning of all that. And we'll talk about fate in a minute. That's part of the shadow of this. And then tarot cards, because of theosophists and then before them just different people interested in magic. There have been a lot of claims about where tarot cards come from. It was the Egypt theory was pushed for a while, and other sources. They were invented in Italy. That's where they come from. And Filippo Visconti had them commissioned because it was trendy to have personalized decks of playing cards in the salons of the nobility in Italy at that time. So he got somebody who actually had some knowledge of astrology and esoteric lore, and they commissioned an artist who was pretty good. So the first decks come from there. Now, tarot is also a game. I learned how to play it at one point. I don't think I remember anymore, but there's a game that you can play too. And ultimately, if I remember correctly, playing cards themselves originated in Korea a long time ago. So that's the ultimate source. But tarot is from Italy. And so there's many different tarot spreads. There's many different tarot decks. A lot of them are based on the Rider-Waite deck, which I think actually should be called the Pamela Colman Smith deck, because that was the name of the artist. And although A.E. Waite, the esotericist, provided some one-liners or two-liners for each card in terms of interpretation, he didn't really provide that much. And so the real symbolism of the cards, the real meaning of the cards were brought out by the artist, Pamela Colman Smith. So I'm hoping that someday she'll get more recognition and the deck will be renamed for her. But that ended up being kind of the template for many other tarot decks, although not all. So the basic idea here is to formulate a question, do a spread, or just pull a card. And a big difference between tarot readings and I Ching readings is that the I Ching is much more specific in its readings. It can still be held symbolically, and it has to be, actually. So when it talks about crossing the Great River, it doesn't mean getting in a canoe. But tarot cards in some ways are even more symbolic because they're not verbal, except for little labels on each card. They're actually imagistic, and so letting the images work on you and speak to you is a good way of reading those. So even if you go to a tarot expert and you have a reading done, don't neglect your own symbolic capacity. You can interpret the symbols something like you would interpret dreams by free associating to them and seeing what comes up and resonates. So that's a popular method too. There's also runes and geomancy, which is an umbrella term for lots of different methods from lots of different cultures, somehow reading the earth itself. So, making marks in the earth and then reading those, making them as much at random as you can and then reading those. That's one form of doing it. But there are so many divination methods, I couldn't possibly mention them all. So what I'm going to do is give you some more suggestions for how to use divination as part of your spiritual practice. So don't neglect the preparation stage. And a lot of really good oracles and readers will emphasize this, that you need to prepare the moment. And everybody does it differently. Some people sage their cards and all that stuff. You don't need to do that if it doesn't speak to you, but I usually don't. But I do take a moment and not only formulate a question, but I ask myself, why am I asking? What is it that I really want to gain from this? So you enter a liminal moment, a sacred moment, and let that be what it is for a while, and then do the reading. I mentioned don't ask twice. And I also recommend, some people use altars, but leaving the reading out for a little bit, or else recording it or photographing it, because if it doesn't make sense, it may soon. So keep that in mind too. I always do these at times when I can really sit with the reading and let it in. And I never assume that I immediately know what it says. Some readings, like the one I mentioned earlier, sound pretty obvious. You hold together with the wrong people is pretty obvious. But it can mean other things too. It can mean deeper things. It can mean you have a habit of holding together with the wrong people. You need to look at that. which at that time I did. So I would sit with it, go deeper with it, see what comes to mind, ask your inner self, what do you think about this? And really give it the space that it needs to move in you. Also, I would look for confirmations outside, and I have a recent example of this. So I'm facing a situation with some turbulence in it, and I'm just sitting with it and waiting to see what unfolds. But I thought I would run it by the oracle first, and so before I did the reading, I went and took a walk, and I was outside and listening to things and looking at the sky and all that, and just kind of passively letting the issue sit in my consciousness. And I had a very brief association that I was hardly even sure existed. There's a scene from one of the first Matrix film, actually, where Neo, the protagonist, is being operated on after going through all kinds of stuff. And he has no idea where he is or who's working on him or anything. And Morpheus says, the answers are coming. So I went home and I did a reading. And one of the lines in the oracle that I consulted says, the answers are coming. Sometimes you don't even need the reading, right? Just let your imagination and your intuition work, you know. So that's what I mean by confirmation. The more indicators you get, the more it fills in the picture for you. Now, I mentioned prediction earlier. I want to say a little bit more about that. So a criticism that's frequently leveled by outsiders against practitioners of divination, and there's some truth in it, is that we're trying to foretell the future. And that's an understandable desire, especially when you're in a situation whose outcome you really are going to be impacted by and you have no idea what's going to happen. I suggest, as part of your spiritual practice, that you not ask about the future. I think a more effective way of using divination is to ask, what do I need to know in order to deal wisely with what's coming? And my experience, too, has been that you'll get a much clearer answer. Sometimes when I've slipped into wanting to ask about the future, whatever oracle I'm consulting, it'll flat not answer. I created my own, by the way, some years ago as a creative activity. It's called the Prime Mover Oracle. And sometimes when I've used my own oracle, it'll answer a different question if I slip into what's going to happen, you know. It'll say, isn't the weather nice outside, or something like that, you know. Go outside and enjoy it. So it's a little bit like a Zen master. That's the wrong question. So you'll get those responses too. So I just recommend not trying to use it to predict the future. The future's not written anyway. So another suggestion is not to depend on oracles at all. I would use them for feedback, but I wouldn't get dependent. And when you're constantly doing readings, then you're dependent on it. And what you're doing is you're moving the power out of you into the oracle. The locus of decision making is now in the oracle, and that's problematic. And it's also an invitation for some trickster stuff to happen to you in order to bring you back to yourself. So I remember there was a period of my life where I was doing readings all the time. And I had a dream in which I was supposed to go through this passageway, but I couldn't fit. And it was shaped like a small square hole. And there was somebody in the room with me who said, just take the stairs, you know, kind of impatiently, right? And I woke up, and my first association to that square hole was that it looked like the square hole in the I Ching coins I use. So I took the dream to mean, quit doing that. Just walk there. Just go there, right? So another reason not to try to use it for prediction. When you're doing that, you're trying to control things, right? And control and the spiritual path tend not to go together very well. So not depending on them, and also not buying into fatalism. I've known a few astrologers who are very fatalistic about what's happening with transits and the movements of the planets and all that. what's in your natal chart. But for me, the real interest is in what you do with that information. So I liken it to sailing in turbulent weather, which, by the way, you shouldn't do. But let's say you're out somewhere and the wind starts to veer around and blow different ways. So you don't have any control over that. You can't control the weather, especially when you're sitting in a sailboat. But you can operate the boat and adjust to the weather and sail on the wind. So likewise, when something really ominous is being predicted from transits in astrology, something will happen in my experience, but how it manifests, how it actually shows up, is largely dependent on how we face it. So that's something to bear in mind too. I like, incidentally, the old Gnostic tales that were critical of the Hellenistic, as we would now call them, astrologers of the time. Hellenistic astrology tends to be pretty fatalistic. And in these Gnostic tales, the Christian ones, Jesus kind of waves his hand magically and he sets half the oracles, or excuse me, half the planets spinning out of action. So what results from this is that from that point forward in these old stories and myths, astrology only works half the time. So I wouldn't take it literally, but it's a fun story to think about. So no fatalism in terms of not giving up our freedom of choice and insisting on making our own way in the world. There's also old myths where even the gods get questioned by human beings. So, and I have a contemporary example of this that's actually a comedy. If you see the movie Stranger Than Fiction, I'm about to spoil something important, so if you don't want to hear it, you might want to fast forward. But the movie's been around for a while, so I'm going to go ahead and do it anyway. But Will Ferrell plays a fictional character, and Emma Thompson plays his author. And she doesn't realize that the character that she's writing in a novel really exists. This is kind of metaphysical if we play with it a little bit. And so there's a scene where he finds her. He works for the IRS, so he looks up her address in the tax records, knocks on the door, and he overheard her. That's another part of this. He can hear her thinking, and he knows that the story's going to end in tragedy. So he knocks on the door, and he faces his creator and says, "Please don't kill me." And it changes her. So those are some stories to keep in mind too, that even when the gods are concerned, it's not all set in stone. So let's go back to synchronicity, and I want to suggest a different way of thinking about this, and that seems like a good note to end on. So instead of seeing synchronicity as some kind of an impersonal law, what about thinking of it as a gesture, as a meaningful communication from an animate universe? When Jung talks about synchronicity, there's a huge cultural background that he was familiar with that goes all the way back to ancient Egypt, where they refer to correspondences, that everything in the cosmos corresponds with everything else, and some connections are more prominent and meaningful than others. The Egyptians actually had a word for this, Heka, and sometimes it referred to the goddess who oversees this, and sometimes to the correspondences themselves. So the Stoic philosophers pick this up, and they call it sympathies, which is a nice word, sympatheia. And Swedenborg gets in on it and uses other terminology. And so synchronicity might be one way of holding it, but if we think of it as things are in sympathy with us, that what we're getting is a sympathetic response, that it shows the aliveness of things, the animation and sentience of things, even of the book that we're looking at or the cards that we spread, that somehow their consciousness too participates in this in its own way, not a human way. So I had an example of this earlier today, which is one of the reasons I decided on this as a topic. There's a trail I walk on almost every day. And I won't go into all the associations, and I'm not a baseball fan particularly, but whenever my career is getting ready to shift in a big way, baseballs start showing up, and there's reasons for that I won't go into. So 2 days ago, I was outside my home here, which is near a very busy highway, busy during the day, and somebody threw a small green ball out the window, and it came bouncing across the highway to me. So I have it. They didn't come back for it. So I thought, what is this? Green maybe means go, maybe means move forward. There's some things I've been waiting on. So I just kind of sat with it. I didn't need to have it come to any firm conclusion. I just thought it's an indicator, nothing more, you know. So I'm out walking today, and so I've walked for the better part of a year, almost daily, down this same trail. It's nowhere near a baseball field, and this has never happened before. I'm walking up the trail, and it's lined with a fence on one side, and there's a baseball sitting right there. So I assume somebody found it and went, I better leave it out so that whoever left it out here can find it. I left it where it was. But I guarantee it, something having to do with my work is about to change big time. So I'm grateful for the indication, and I'll close by saying I think that's a useful way of looking at this, that it's not just a cosmic weather report of what's happening during the time, but it's also a gift when these things happen, whether we seek out the oracles or they happen spontaneously. And I think a good attitude to have is that we've just been noticed by whatever we call spirit, mystery, big mind, or what have you. And it's giving us a little hint about how to adapt to changing times. May the week bring you blessings.